A wounded Navy SEAL lay frozen behind the sanctuary, his hand raised, as if begging someone not to fire. A black panther stood over him in the snow, golden eyes burning through the storm. FBI agent Jessica Ward aimed her weapon, while K9 Rin suddenly refused to move. Then the SEAL whispered, "Don't shoot. It's the only witness. If you believe God can reveal truth through the forgotten, leave amen." Snow had been falling over Silverpine Harbor, Michigan, since late afternoon. Soft at first, then steady enough to turn the little northern town into a world of white roofs, blue shadows, and quiet roads. The harbor lights glowed through the storm like small candles set along the frozen edge of Lake Michigan. Beyond the docks, dark pine trees climbed the hills, their branches bowed beneath the weight of winter. Farther north, behind a private road and a set of golden iron gates, North Star Wildlife Trust slept under the snow, like a place too beautiful to be questioned. FBI agent Jessica Ward sat alone in a temporary field office above the county records building. At 28, Jessica had the alert stillness of someone who had learned to listen before she spoke. She had chestnut hair tied low at the back of her neck, blue-gray eyes that rarely missed small details, and a calm face that could look gentle until a lie crossed her desk. Tonight she wore a dark navy FBI jacket over a gray sweater, black tactical pants, and worn winter boots dusted with salt. Her role in this case was not to chase the loudest suspect. She was the one who connected files no one else thought belonged together. On the desk before her lay 3 folders. The first involved North Star Wildlife Trust, a famous sanctuary praised for rescuing rare animals. The second involved a shipment of imported antiques. The third involved a luxury food company that catered charity events for wealthy donors. On paper, they were separate matters, dull enough to make a tired man reach for coffee and surrender. But Jessica had been staring at them for 2 hours, and the longer she stared, the less innocent they looked. All 3 mentioned Blue Harbor Logistics. All 3 misspelled the same port name in the same peculiar way. All 3 carried a payment of $18,700, hidden under different labels: habitat repairs, fragile cargo handling, cold storage support, and all 3 shipping forms had the same faint blur near the signature line, as if the truth had been rubbed thin by careful hands. Beside her chair lay Rin, her 5-year-old German Shepherd K9. Rin had a thick sable coat, amber brown eyes, and the kind of quiet discipline that made strangers step back and children whisper in awe. He was powerful without being restless, loyal without being needy, and far wiser than most people who wore expensive shoes. Jessica often joked that Rin could judge a room faster than a committee. Tonight he had been sleeping with one ear open until Jessica turned over a photograph of an old wooden crate. Rin rose. He did not bark. He did not paw at her. He simply stood, ears forward, eyes fixed on the photograph as if something inside the flat gray image still carried a scent the room had forgotten. Jessica looked down at him, then back at the crate. It was listed as educational display material donated to North Star for a winter fundraiser. The label was clean, too clean. "Easy, boy," she whispered. Rin did not move. A sudden buzz cut through the room. Jessica's phone trembled against the metal desk, loud in the silence, and Rin's head snapped toward it before her hand even reached the screen. For one strange second, the snow outside seemed to stop falling. The message was from Caleb Stone. Caleb was 35. A former Navy SEAL with broad shoulders, short dark brown hair, light stubble along a square jaw, and eyes that carried the weather of too many hard places. He was not officially leading anything. He had been asked to observe a suspicious Blue Harbor route because he knew ports, night movements, and the little patterns people made when they believed darkness was on their side. Caleb was usually dry, steady, and careful with words. His message had none of his usual restraint. Blue Harbor truck, North Star, North Gate. Live animal. Moving now. Jessica called him immediately. No answer. She called again. Nothing. Her stomach tightened, not with panic, but with the cold recognition that a quiet case had just opened its eyes. She grabbed her keys, her radio, and her sidearm, then looked at Rin. "Come." Rin was already at the door. The drive north took 12 minutes and felt much longer. Snow swept through the headlights in silver ribbons. The road climbed away from town, past closed bait shops, frozen mailboxes, and dark farmhouses with porch lights glowing like watchful stars. Rin sat in the back of the SUV, silent and upright. That silence worried Jessica more than a growl would have. Rin only became that still when every part of him was listening. The golden gates of North Star appeared through the snowfall. The main entrance was closed, but the service road beyond the north fence showed fresh tire tracks. Jessica followed them slowly, headlights off for the last stretch, letting the dim winter moon and the pale shine of snow guide the vehicle. Ahead, behind a low storage building, a side gate hung open. She parked behind a line of pines and stepped out. The cold touched her face like a warning. At once, she saw signs of haste. A half-open gate, papers scattered across the snow, a temporary transport cage tilted near a loading ramp, and tire marks cutting sharply toward the back road. A truck had left in a hurry. People had left in a hurry, but something else had not. Rin lowered his head and pulled toward the slope behind the storage building. Jessica kept the leash firm, and her voice lower than the wind. "Easy, Rin. Hold close." They moved past the cage. Its side door was bent. One cheap secondary lock dangled uselessly from the frame. A strip of leather restraint lay frozen into the snow. Jessica caught the sharp smell of fuel, metal, and veterinary sedative. Then Rin stopped at the edge of the slope. Below them, the ground dipped toward the pine line. Jessica saw Caleb first. He lay half on his side in the snow, a dark red winter field jacket stark against the white ground. One arm was folded awkwardly beneath him, and his breathing came shallow, visible in pale bursts. He was conscious, but barely. His face was tight with pain, his jaw clenched, his eyes fighting to stay open. Then Jessica saw the animal beside him. A black leopard stood less than a step from Caleb's shoulder. It was large, sleek, and terrible in its beauty, with a coat so dark it seemed carved from the night itself. Under the moonlight, faint rosettes moved through the black fur like hidden constellations. Its golden eyes burned against the snow. One paw rested near Caleb's upper arm. Its body was tense, but not coiled to spring. It did not drag him. It did not roar. It breathed hard, flanks trembling, eyes flicking from the trees to Jessica, from Jessica to the open path behind it. For one heartbeat, the world narrowed to 3 living things and one impossible choice. Jessica raised her weapon, but she did not fire. Rin stood low beside her. Muscles tight, ears sharp, but he did not lunge. That mattered. Rin knew danger. He also knew the difference between a threat moving toward them and a frightened creature looking for a way out. Caleb's lips moved. Jessica leaned just enough to hear. "Don't." His voice was thin, rough as frost over gravel. "It didn't hurt me." The leopard turned its head toward Jessica. Snow gathered along its whiskers. There was nothing tame in it, nothing gentle in the way people like to imagine wild things become grateful. It was wild, afraid, and free only by accident. That made it dangerous. But not guilty. Jessica lifted the barrel toward the empty sky above the pine ridge, away from homes, roads, and any living target. She took one breath and fired a single warning round into the open winter air. The sound cracked across the storage yard, rolled into the trees, and broke the frozen stillness. The leopard flinched, stepped back, and looked once toward Caleb. Not with human understanding, not with affection, but with the brief, watchful pause of a creature choosing distance over conflict. Then it turned and vanished into the pines, a shadow swallowed by snowfall. Jessica ran down the slope. Rin reached Caleb first and planted himself between the injured man and the forest, watching the darkness without a sound. Jessica knelt beside Caleb, checked his breathing, and pressed her radio. "Agent Ward, I need medical support and wildlife response at North Star North Service Road. One injured male, escaped exotic animal. Approach quiet." No sirens inside the tree line. Caleb's hand found her sleeve. His grip was weak, but urgent. "The Panther," he whispered. "I know. Save your strength." His eyes fixed on hers. "The Panther is evidence, not the threat." Jessica looked from him to the bent cage above the slope, then toward the black forest where the animal had disappeared. Snow filled the tracks almost as quickly as the night made them, but the truth had already stepped out of the cage. This was not an escaped animal problem. This was not a wounded seal problem. This was something larger, something hidden behind clean invoices, charity banners, and kind words spoken under warm lights. In the blue silence of Silver Peen Harbor, A frightened black leopard had become the first living witness. Morning came to Silverpeen Harbor with a pale blue light, the kind of winter light that made every roof, pine branch and frozen road look forgiven before the day had even begun. Snow lay fresh over the town, softening the harbor docks, the old bait shop signs, the church steeple, and the long road that climbed toward North Star Wildlife Trust. From the outside, North Star looked less like a crime scene and more like a promise. Its golden gates rose between two stone pillars. Beyond them, neat walking paths curved through white fields, red barns, glass enclosures, and heated viewing shelters where families gathered with paper cups of cocoa. Children in bright coats pointed at rescued owls behind clean fencing. Volunteers in green jackets smiled as if the cold itself had been trained to behave. Jessica Ward stood just inside the main entrance with Wren at her left side. The night before still clung to her. Caleb's weak grip on her sleeve, the bent transport cage, the black leopard vanishing into the snowy pines. But the sanctuary in daylight seemed determined to deny the memory. It had banners about compassion. It had hand-painted signs about returning wild souls to open country. It had a gift shop window full of plush animals and little wooden ornaments. Jessica had seen enough lies in her life to know the most polished ones often smelled faintly of pine soap and fresh paint. Wren moved calmly beside her, his sable coat catching flakes of snow that had begun to fall again. He did not pull. He did not bark. He watched. That was his gift. Some dogs searched with their noses first. Wren searched with his whole body, his ears angled toward closed doors. His eyes followed workers who moved too quickly. His paws slowed when the ground told him something the air had not yet confessed. Eleanor Voss came down the main path, as if she had been expected by the snow itself. She was 56, tall and graceful, with silver hair swept into a smooth knot and pale skin warmed by a careful smile. Her cream wool coat looked expensive but not showy, and a small gold pin shaped like a bird rested near her collar. Her voice, when she greeted Jessica, was soft enough to comfort a nervous donor and steady enough to command a room. People in Silverpeen called her a guardian of forgotten creatures. She had built North Star after inheriting old family land, and the story went that she had turned grief over her late husband into a life of service. Jessica did not dismiss that story. Most masks were made from something real. "Agent Ward," Eleanor said, extending a gloved hand. "I wish we were meeting under gentler circumstances." "So do I," Jessica replied. Eleanor glanced at Wren with practiced warmth. And this must be Wren. What a beautiful shepherd, very focused. He usually is. Then perhaps he and I have something in common, Eleanor said with a faint smile. North Star requires focus. These animals arrive from difficult places. Neglect, illegal ownership, private collectors, who grow tired of responsibility, we try to give them dignity again. The words were graceful. Jessica let them settle without accepting them. "I need to ask about an animal listed in your records. A black leopard named Aurora." For the first time, Eleanor's smile paused. Not vanished, paused. It was the kind of pause Jessica had learned to respect more than a confession. "Aurora," Eleanor said gently, "was transferred to a specialized recovery partner in Oregon 3 weeks ago." Jessica kept her expression calm. "Your current file lists her as housed here in Silverpeen. Then the file is outdated. Sadly, paperwork often moves slower than living things." Wren's ears shifted. Somewhere behind the visitor center, metal gave a sudden hollow clang, not loud enough to startle the families near the owl enclosure, but sharp enough to slice the morning in two. Wren froze, one paw lifted above the snow, and Jessica felt the whole sanctuary take a breath. It did not want anyone to hear. Eleanor turned her head only slightly. "Maintenance, the cold makes every hinge complain." "Does it complain near the rear enclosures often?" Jessica asked. Eleanor's eyes returned to her. "We have many old structures. I can show you the main records office." "I would rather start with Aurora's enclosure." The rear path was not part of the public tour. The snow back there had not been swept as neatly. The fences were taller, the buildings plainer, and the cheerful signs disappeared. A young staff member stood near a supply shed, pretending to check a clipboard. He was thin, maybe 22, with a narrow face, wind-reddened cheeks, and sandy hair escaping from beneath a knit cap. His name tag read Mason. When Jessica asked about the transfer schedule, he looked at Eleanor before answering. That small glance told Jessica more than his words did. "I only handle feed rotation, ma'am," Mason said. His voice was polite, but his fingers tightened around the clipboard until the paper bent. "Transfers go through administration." Eleanor touched his shoulder lightly. "Mason is one of our newer volunteers, very devoted, but still learning our procedures." Mason nodded too quickly. They reached a low building behind a line of pines. A metal nameplate beside one empty enclosure read Aurora. Snow had gathered along the bottom edge, but the plate itself was clean, recently wiped. The enclosure beyond it was empty. Not abandoned empty, prepared empty. A fresh water basin stood near the wall. A heavy scratching post leaned in one corner. The floor had been washed, but Rin lowered his nose near the threshold and stayed there, very still. Jessica looked up at the nearest camera. It pointed toward the roofline, not the enclosure door. "Camera malfunction?" she asked. Eleanor sighed softly, like a patient woman surrounded by small frustrations. "The storm last week shifted several fixtures. We are waiting for repairs. Convenient timing." "I understand how that looks. Do you?" The warmth in Eleanor's face cooled by one careful degree. "Agent Ward Northstar has spent years earning public trust. We do not hide animals in the dark." Jessica glanced at the empty enclosure. "Then Aurora should be easy to find on paper." "She is." "I hope so by noon." Jessica had enough contradictions to fill the passenger seat. By late afternoon, she was at Silver Pine Regional Hospital, where Caleb Stone lay propped against white pillows under fluorescent lights that made every bruise of exhaustion look honest. His dark hair was rough from sleep, his stubble heavier than the night before, and one shoulder was secured to keep him still. He looked like a man annoyed less by pain than by the fact that pain had made him temporarily useful only in conversation. A nurse named Linda Perez checked his monitor before leaving them alone. Linda was in her early 60s, short and solidly built, with warm brown skin, gray-streaked black hair pulled tight, and the practical kindness of someone who had seen proud men try to pretend they were not hurting. She pointed 2 fingers at Caleb and said, "No hero speeches, 2 minutes at a time." Then she looked at Jessica. "And you, Agent, do not let him negotiate with his own ribs." She left before Caleb could object. Jessica almost smiled. "She has your number." "She has everyone's number." Rin sat beside the bed, watching Caleb with quiet concern. Caleb lowered his good hand, and Rin allowed one brief touch along the top of his head before returning his gaze to the door. Jessica opened her notebook. "Tell me what happened before I arrived." Caleb's jaw tightened, not from pride this time, but memory. "I stayed outside the fence, like we agreed. Blue Harbor came through the north gate with lights dimmed. They weren't scheduled. I saw a crate being moved from the rear building, too large for food, too reinforced for antiques. I sent you the message. And then they spotted my tracks near the service road. Fresh snow made me look less clever than I felt." A thin attempt at humor crossed his face and faded. "They rushed the loading. The ramp slipped. The side latch failed. The leopard came out confused. One man tried to force it back with a pole. I moved closer to give it space through the open side. The cage shifted. I went down the slope." "It did not come after you?" "No." Caleb met her eyes. "It wanted out, not me." Jessica thought of Aurora's clean nameplate, and the camera aimed at nothing. "Eleanor says Aurora was transferred to Oregon 3 weeks ago." Caleb gave a small, humorless breath. "Then Oregon has very long shadows." Jessica placed a printed photo on his tray. The leopard's tracks beside Caleb's, pressed deep into last night's snow. Caleb looked at it, then at Rin. "That animal is not their mistake. It is their record." Jessica nodded slowly. A name on paper, a missing enclosure, a live animal moved at night, and someone at Northstar knew the paperwork would protect them. By evening, Jessica returned to the temporary office. Snow tapped softly against the window, patient as an old witness. She laid Aurora's file on the desk beside the photograph of the tracks. One folder said the leopard was gone. One empty enclosure said it had been there. One wounded seal said it had been moved in secret. Rin rested his chin near the papers, his amber eyes open and watchful. Jessica stared at the name Aurora until the letters seemed less like a name and more like a key. Somewhere behind North Star's golden gates, behind Eleanor Voss's gentle voice and the sanctuary's clean pathways, that key fit a lock someone desperately wanted to keep closed, and Jessica intended to open it. By the next morning, Silverpine Harbor had grown even quieter beneath another layer of snow. The storm had softened the rough edges of the service road behind North Star Wildlife Trust, but it had not erased everything. Snow had a strange honesty to it. It covered what people wished to hide, yet it also held the shape of every step, every tire, every hurried mistake. Jessica Ward returned to the North Service Yard just after sunrise with Wren at her side, and a small technical team behind her. The golden gates and cheerful visitor paths were far away now. Back here, North Star looked less like a sanctuary, and more like the back of a stage after the audience had gone home. Special Agent Nora Keene led the evidence team. She was 42, compact and strong, with dark curly hair tucked beneath a navy knit cap and brown eyes that missed very little. Years before, a warehouse collapse during an evidence search had left her with a slight limp, but it had also made her more careful than impatient. She treated every scene like a sentence written by someone trying not to confess. Beside her walked Deputy Owen Marks from the county sheriff's office, a tall, broad man in his late 50s with a gray mustache, weathered skin, and the steady sadness of someone who had spent too many winters knocking on doors with bad news. He knew every back road around Silverpine, and when he looked at the service yard, his jaw tightened. This place was never built for heavy night traffic, Owen said, nodding toward the loading ramp. Too narrow, too slick. Whoever moved that cage was in a hurry. Jessica looked at the tilted transport cage near the ramp. In daylight, it seemed less mysterious and more shameful. The frame was scratched, the door bent outward, and the secondary latch hung loose like a false promise. A proper cage for a large wild cat should have carried inspection tags, reinforced locks, and clean handling records. This one had mismatched fasteners, temporary straps, and a cheap metal latch that looked as if it had been added by someone who cared more about speed than safety. Dr. Miriam Velez arrived shortly after them in a white wildlife response truck. She was a wildlife veterinarian in her early 50s, tall and lean, with copper, brown skin, silver, threaded black hair in a long braid, and a calm voice that made even nervous officers lower their own. She had spent 20 years working with rescued big cats, animals taken from private collections, roadside shows, and illegal holding sites. Her kindness was not soft, it was disciplined, born from knowing that love for wild creatures meant respecting their distance. She examined the cage without touching it at first. This was not a proper long-distance transport setup, she said. The lock was poorly fitted, the side panel bent where the ramp shifted. If the animal was already frightened and partly sedated, one hard movement could have been enough for it to force a gap. So it did not escape because it was clever enough to open the cage, Jessica said. Dr. Velez shook her head. No, it escaped because people were careless and rushed. Wren circled slowly near the ramp, nose low, paws silent in the snow. His sable coat stood out against the white ground, and his amber eyes moved between the cage, the ramp, and the slope where Caleb had fallen. He did not treat the scene like a place of battle. He treated it like a puzzle with scent as its language. Jessica watched him pause at a strip of leather frozen near the ramp. He lowered his head, breathed once, then looked back at her. Nora photographed it before lifting it into an evidence bag. Leather restraint, smells like chemical sedative. Dr. Velez leaned closer. Likely used around the cage, not necessarily on the animal itself. But yes, veterinary handling materials. A thin metallic tick came from the bent cage door. Everyone stopped. The sound was tiny, almost polite, but in the cold silence, it felt like a warning bell. A bead of ice slid from the latch and dropped into the snow, leaving the broken lock trembling by a thread. Jessica held the moment. A sound that small should not have mattered, yet it made the whole scene speak. Last night, in the dark, with men rushing, a truck idling, a ramp slipping, and a frightened leopard pressing against weak metal, that little latch had been the difference between a hidden shipment and a living witness loose in the snow. Dr. Velez crouched near the tracks where the leopard had moved away from the cage. A melanistic leopard, she said quietly. People call it a black leopard, but it is not a separate species. It is a leopard with dark pigmentation, It is not native to Michigan. Someone brought it here. Owen let out a slow breath. A big cat in our woods that will terrify half the county if word gets out wrong. Then we make sure word gets out carefully, Jessica said. Dr. Velez nodded. That animal is dangerous because it is wild, but dangerous does not mean guilty. A wild cat usually avoids people if it has space. It becomes a serious threat when cornered, hurt, trapped, or blocked from escape. Last night, Caleb Stone was lying still. He was not shouting, he was not waving his arms. He was not closing off its path. To that leopard, he may have been the least threatening thing in a very frightening place. Jessica thought of Caleb's pale face in the snow, his hand gripping her sleeve. The panther is evidence, not the threat. He had understood it before anyone had explained it. The team moved down the slope. Nora marked where Caleb had fallen. The snow showed a long slide, then a deep mark near the old wooden fence. A broken rail leaned outward. Caleb had not been mauled by an animal. He had been thrown by bad equipment, ice, panic, and the force of a cage swinging wrong on a ramp. That truth mattered. It changed the story from wild danger to human negligence. Rin moved beyond the fence line toward a patch of packed snow near the service road. His head lowered again. Jessica followed. There, half covered by fresh powder, were tire marks wide enough for a refrigerated truck. The tread pattern was clean in the deeper snow where the vehicle had turned too sharply. Owen crouched beside it. Blue Harbor uses trucks with this kind of winter tread, he said. I have seen them at the seafood dock. Jessica looked at him. Only the dock. Owen hesitated. No, a few times near the old Brenner warehouse outside town. Antique storage, I think. And once behind the Lake House Hotel before a charity dinner. Jessica's mind placed the names beside the folders on her desk. North Star Antiques, luxury food, 3 separate doors, 1 set of tire tracks. Nora lifted another small item from near the road. It was a torn shipping label, the edge soaked and stiff from snow. Most of the print had smeared, but part of the company name remained visible, Blue Harbor Logistics. Beneath it was a line of destination text. Jessica's eyes narrowed. The port name was misspelled exactly the same way it had been in the 3 files. Not a random error, a copied template. She stood very still while the snow fell around her. Behind the loading ramp, Dr. Velez spoke softly into a phone, arranging a wildlife response perimeter. Owen radioed in a quiet advisory, careful not to start a town panic. Nora bagged the label. Rin stood beside the tire mark and looked toward the road, his ears forward, as if he could hear the truck still fleeing through the night. Jessica understood now why the smugglers had left so quickly. They had not been frightened by Caleb alone. Caleb had sent the message. They had seen signs they were no longer unseen. They had heard movement on the road and chosen to protect the larger route rather than recover one escaped animal. A cage could be abandoned. A driver could disappear. A loose leopard could be explained as a tragic accident if the right papers appeared in the morning. But a shipping route, a money trail, and a ledger could bring down the whole shining kingdom behind the golden gates. She crouched beside Rin and touched the edge of the torn label through the evidence bag. The same wrong spelling stared back at her like a fingerprint. Blue Harbor had been at North Star. Blue Harbor had touched the antique warehouse. Blue Harbor had supplied the charity dinner circuit. And somewhere behind those roots, someone was using clean documents to move living creatures through the dark. Rin pressed his nose once to the snow beside the tire track, then lifted his head toward Jessica. No bark, no command needed. Just that steady look, the one that always seemed to say the world had left a trail, and humans were finally catching up. Jessica looked from the faulty cage to the fading tire marks, then toward the northern road where the truck had vanished. The leopard had not broken the case open with rage. It had broken it open by surviving. And now, in the white silence behind North Star, Jessica could see the shape of the hand that had built the lie. The papers, the night truck, and the black leopard all belonged to the same hidden road. 4 days after the night, Caleb Stone was found in the snow. Silverpeen Harbor woke beneath another soft fall of winter. The lake was hidden behind a pale curtain of mist. The harbor bells moved in the wind, and the northern woods beyond North Star Wildlife Trust stood silent under white branches. Jessica Ward had learned that snow could be both mercy and witness. It covered rough ground with a clean face, but it also held the shape of every secret, until someone patient enough came looking. That morning, she came looking with Wren, Dr. Miriam Velez, and a county forest ranger named Thomas Bell. Thomas Bell was 61, tall and narrow as an old fence post, with a weathered face, clear gray eyes, and a white beard trimmed close to his jaw. He had spent 30 years walking the forests north of Silverpine, and he moved through the trees with the quiet respect of a man entering a chapel. He had once lost a young hiker during a sudden whiteout, and since then he treated winter not as scenery, but as a living force that had to be read carefully. He did not talk much. When he did, Jessica listened. Dr. Velez had made the plan plain before they entered the woods. They were not chasing the leopard. They were not calling it in with noise, lights, or men rushing through the trees like heroes in a cheap story. The animal was wild, frightened, and out of place. Their goal was to map its possible movement, find traces of the old transport route, and keep both the public and the animal safe. Jessica respected that. The night at North Star had taught her one hard truth: fear made people move too fast, and fast movement around a frightened wild creature could turn a mistake into sorrow. Wren walked ahead on a long lead, his sable coat brushed with snow, his black harness dark against the pale trail. He did not pull like an excited dog. He worked with slow purpose, nose low, shoulders steady, ears shifting with every soft crack of frozen bark. He followed the faint scent of leather restraint and veterinary sedative from the service road into an old logging path north of the sanctuary. The trail curved away from the public grounds, past black spruce, birch trunks, and rocks glazed with ice. Jessica noticed the first sign near a low branch. The branch had been snapped, not by wind, but by something heavy forced through in haste. A few yards farther, Thomas pointed with one gloved hand to a shallow groove in the hard snow, now glazed over by cold. "Something was dragged here before the last snowfall," he said. "Not yesterday. Before your night at the service yard, Doctor." Velez crouched beside the mark. A transport cage, maybe, or a crate being shifted off a smaller vehicle. Jessica took photographs, then looked back toward North Star. The sanctuary roofs were barely visible through the trees, bright and harmless from this distance. A place with golden gates in front and hidden roads behind. She thought of Eleanor Voss's gentle voice, of the clean nameplate that read Aurora, of the empty enclosure that had been washed too carefully. People could make almost anything look kind if they controlled where visitors were allowed to stand. They moved deeper into the woods. Wren paused near a patch of snow disturbed beneath a cedar. Jessica found a small piece of black plastic caught in the frozen grass. It looked like part of a temporary cage lock. Nora Keene would need to confirm it later, but Jessica already felt the shape of the evidence forming. The service yard was not the first place the leopard had been mishandled. This forest route had been used before. Then the woods went still, not quiet, still. A clump of snow dropped from a pine branch with a soft, heavy whisper, and Wren froze mid-step. One paw raised above the trail, his ears lifted toward the ridge. For 3 breaths, no one moved, and the forest seemed to hold its heart in its hands. Jessica followed Wren's gaze. On a snow-covered rock ledge above them stood the black leopard. It was far enough away that Jessica did not feel the need to raise her weapon, but close enough for every detail to enter her memory. Its dark body cut a clean shape against the white ridge, powerful, lean, and motionless. Under the winterlight, faint markings moved across its coat like shadows under deep water. Its golden eyes watched the group without softness, without trust, and without panic. It did not crouch to spring. It did not move toward them. It simply stood with the forest at its back and open space before it, deciding what the world had become. "Hold," Jessica said softly. Wren obeyed at once. He lowered his body but did not surge forward. His discipline was a quiet miracle, the kind no crowd would cheer for because no one outside that moment understood how much restraint it took. Dr. Velez raised one hand, palm down, a silent request for everyone to stay calm. "That is not a pet," she whispered, "and it is not asking for help. It is choosing distance because distance is safety." Thomas kept his eyes low, not staring directly at the animal. "Plenty of room behind it," he murmured. "It can leave if it wants." Jessica let the words settle. The leopard was not returning like some grateful spirit from a fairy tale. It had not come to guide them. It was following old scent lines, old fear, old roots pressed into the land by human hands. It had been taken through these trees once, perhaps more than once. Now, free by accident, and still wary of every sound, it had drifted near the path that had first stolen its peace. The leopard turned its head slightly toward the north. Snow moved around its paws. For a single strange moment, Jessica thought of Caleb lying still in the snow, refusing to let fear name the animal as the enemy. The panther is evidence, not the threat. He had been right, but Dr. Velez was right too. Evidence could still have teeth. Innocence did not make a wild creature safe to touch. Mercy required wisdom, or it became pride wearing a halo. The leopard stepped backward once. Then again, it turned, silent as spilled ink, and vanished between the pines. No farewell, no tame gesture, no storybook bow. Only a dark body choosing the deeper woods over human company. Rin waited until Jessica gave the smallest nod, then he moved. Not toward the ridge path where the leopard had gone, but toward the base of the rock ledge. His nose found something under the crusted snow. He pawed once, gently. Thomas used a small folding shovel to loosen the ice. Beneath it lay a torn transport tag, half frozen into the ground. Jessica lifted it with gloved fingers and felt the old familiar chill of a lie becoming visible. The tag bore the faded mark of Blue Harbor Logistics. Most of the printed route had worn away, but the cargo code remained. Dr. Velez leaned closer. "Educational display material," she read. Jessica's jaw tightened. That was the phrase from the North Star donation file. The same phrase attached to the wooden crate Rin had reacted to in the field office. The same category tied to the antique shipment. The same kind words used to hide something that could breathe, fear, and run. Thomas looked toward the place where the leopard had disappeared. It came back along the road that brought it here. Jessica nodded. "Not for us." "No," Dr. Velez said. "For distance, for cover, for anything that was not a cage." They stood there a moment longer while snow filled the shallow marks on the ridge. Jessica held the torn tag in an evident sleeve, watching the white wood swallow the last visible sign of the animal. She felt no triumph, only a heavier kind of understanding. The leopard was dangerous because it was wild, but it was not guilty. The guilt belonged to the people who had turned living beauty into cargo, who had written soft words on hard cages, who had hidden greed beneath polished charity language, and warm lights. Rin stood beside her, eyes fixed on the trees. He did not bark after the leopard. He did not ask to chase. He simply watched, as if honoring the line between rescue and possession. Jessica placed one hand briefly on his shoulder. Behind them, the trail led back to North Star, to files, donors, and golden gates. Ahead of them, the leopard's tracks faded into the northern forest. Jessica looked at the torn Blue Harbor tag in her hand and understood that the animal had not led them like a guide from legend. It had done something more honest. It had survived, and survival had left a trail. By the time Jessica Ward returned from the northern ridge, the torn Blue Harbor tag had already begun to feel heavier than paper. It sat inside an evidence sleeve on the passenger seat, while Rin rested in the back of the SUV, silent and watchful, snow melting from the edges of his sable coat. Outside, Silverpine Harbor moved through another pale winter afternoon. Children dragged sleds past the courthouse steps. A church bell rang somewhere near the frozen marina. Smoke curled from chimneys in slow gray ribbons. The town looked peaceful enough to forgive anything, and that was what troubled Jessica most. Some places hid wrongdoing under noise and fear. Silverpine hid it under good manners, clean sidewalks, and charity banners that fluttered in the snow. The temporary FBI room above county records had changed overnight. What had once been a desk and 3 folders had become a wall of names, arrows, dates, shipment codes, and photographs. Aurora Blue Harbor Logistics, North Star Wildlife Trust, Lake House Hotel, Brenner Antique Storage, the Ark Expansion. Jessica pinned the torn tag from the ridge beneath the photograph of the wooden crate Rin had reacted to days earlier. The cargo description matched educational display material. It sounded harmless, the kind of phrase a donor would smile at before writing a check. But now Jessica had seen where those words led to a bent cage, a wounded seal, and a black leopard moving through snow where it never should have been. Special Agent Nora Keene stood beside the evidence board, one hand on her hip, her sharp brown eyes moving from one line to another. Deputy Owen Marks leaned near the window with his arms folded, watching the road below, as if he expected Blue Harbor to drive past and confess. Dr. Miriam Velez had gone to coordinate a quiet wildlife perimeter, but her words stayed in the room. Dangerous did not mean guilty. Jessica wrote that sentence in the corner of her notebook. It was not evidence. Still, it was truth. The missing piece arrived in the form of a financial analyst from the Detroit field office named Priya Nandakumar. Priya was 37, petite and precise. With warm brown skin, straight black hair cut at her shoulders, and gold-rimmed glasses that seemed to sharpen her already serious face. She had grown up working evenings in her parents' small grocery store, where every missing dollar mattered, and that upbringing had made her almost tender toward numbers. She did not see spreadsheets as cold things. She saw them as footprints left by people who believed money could outrun memory. Priya spread printed ledgers across the table. "North Star's public accounts are beautiful," she said. "Too beautiful. Round explanations, soft categories. Nothing ugly enough to be real." Jessica looked at the first column. "Show me." Priya tapped the page. The same payment appears under different names. $18,700. Habitat repairs, cold storage support, fragile cargo handling, donor event preservation. It repeats across departments that should not be sharing vendors. Nora frowned. Who approves them? On paper, department heads. In practice? Priya flipped to the final page. Everything is reconciled by Martin Vale. Martin Vale was 44, North Star's chief accountant and compliance officer. Jessica had seen his name before, always typed neatly at the bottom of documents that looked almost too organized. He had appeared in photographs behind Eleanor Voss, at fundraising dinners, a narrow man in charcoal suits, pale skin, careful dark hair, and rimless glasses that made him look more like a bank clerk than the architect of anything dangerous. But Jessica had learned that some men did not need loud voices to cause harm. They only needed passwords, patience, and a printer that could make a lie look official. The old radiator behind Jessica gave a sudden hiss, and at the same instant Rin rose from the floor, his ears cutting forward. A single sheet slipped from the evidence board and skated across the room, stopping beneath his paw. For a breath, no one spoke. Then Jessica saw the word at the top of the fallen page. Aurora. Priya picked it up carefully. Lee. That name again. Jessica placed the Aurora records side by side. One file said Aurora had been rescued from an unlicensed private collection. Another said she had been transferred to Oregon. A third billed North Star for specialized feeding costs in Silverpine during the same week. A fourth connected Aurora's transport number to a crate labeled Educational Display Material. A fifth used her image in a donor packet for the upcoming event, A Night for the Wild. The dates did not merely disagree. They folded over one another like badly stacked masks. One animal cannot be in 5 places at once, Owen said. No, Jessica replied. But one name can. Caleb Stone joined by video call from Silverpine Regional Hospital. He was propped against pillows, one shoulder secured, his face still pale beneath the dark stubble along his jaw. He looked tired and irritated by being tired. The nurse must have approved only a short call because he started without greetings. The rear building had 3 cameras. One above the ramp, one facing the side gate, one on the storage door. The ramp camera was turned up. The side camera was working. I saw the red light. Jessica turned to Nora. If that footage still exists, Martin can delete it before the fundraiser. Nora nodded. We move fast but clean, Caleb continued. The truck did not leave by the main service road. It took the old lake road toward Brenner Storage. That road connects to the hotel delivery entrance. Priya looked up from the ledger. The Lake House Hotel is hosting A Night for the Wild tomorrow. The room changed, not loudly. No one shouted, but every person felt the same door open at once. The fundraiser was not just a public event. It was a meeting place, a payment point, and possibly the last chance for North Star to move files, money, and remaining cargo before federal pressure tightened around them. Jessica called up the records for Brenner Antique Storage. Its owner had retired 2 years earlier, but the warehouse remained active under a rental agreement with a shell company tied to North Star's education program. Items moved through it as teaching materials, donated heritage pieces, and fragile displays. The same port name appeared again, misspelled in the familiar way. The same template, the same hand. Rin pressed his nose to the wooden crate photograph, still pinned to the board. Jessica stared at the image, then at the torn tag from the ridge. "We need the physical crate." Nora had it brought from county evidence within the hour. The crate was plain, with old nail marks, layered labels, and a leather strap around one side. Rin approached slowly. He sniffed the strap, then sat down hard, eyes fixed on Jessica. It was his way of placing a flag on the truth. They peeled back the newest label, under controlled evidence procedure. Beneath it was an older route sticker. Main port, Brenner storage, Chicago event kitchen, Silverpine return. The crate had traveled through the antique channel and the luxury food channel before returning to North Star, under a charity label. It was not a box. It was a passport for deception. Priya traced the payments backward. "The money ends in the Ark expansion." "The new sanctuary wing," Owen said. Eleanor's pride and joy. Jessica looked at Eleanor's photo on the board. Silver hair, gentle smile, a gold bird pin near her collar. Eleanor was the face, the voice, the woman who stood before donors and spoke about giving wild creatures dignity. Martin Vale was the hand behind the curtain, building forms, copying signatures, moving numbers until living things became expenses, and expenses became donations. "Eleanor may not type the documents," Jessica said, "but she benefits from every one of them." Nora added Martin's photograph beside hers. "Public saint, private accountant." "Not saint," Jessica said quietly, saleswoman. By evening the board had become a map of a cage without bars. No iron, no chains, only certificates, invoices, donor pledges, cold storage receipts, antique manifests, and soft words printed on thick paper. Jessica stood before it with Rin at her side and Caleb's route notes on the screen. The pieces no longer floated apart. They locked together with terrible grace. A night for the wild was less than 24 hours away. If North Star followed its pattern, the event would bring donors, clients, media, and staff into one shining room while Martin moved records behind the scenes. By morning, the route might be clean again. By morning, Aurora might become just another beautiful story in a brochure. Jessica took the final pin and placed it through the center of the board, connecting Aurora, Blue Harbor, North Star, Brenner Antique Storage, Lake House Hotel, Martin Vale, and Eleanor Voss. She stepped back. The pattern stared back at her. This was not 3 small cases. It was one great cage made of paper. And tomorrow night, Jessica intended to open the door. Snow fell softly against the glass walls of the Lake House Conservatory, turning the frozen shoreline of Silverpine into a pale, glowing dream. Inside, warm golden light poured over polished floors, crystal glasses, dark suits, winter gowns, and long tables covered with white linen. A grand piano played near the center of the room, each note floating gently above the low voices of donors and local reporters. Children from Silverpine Elementary had been invited to display drawings of rescued animals along one wall, and their bright crayon wolves, owls, and big cats made the room look innocent enough to break a heart. Jessica Ward stood near the rear entrance in a black coat over her FBI vest, her badge hidden until the moment it would matter. Rin waited beside her, still and focused, his sable coat brushed clean, his amber eyes moving from the crowd to the service hallway beyond the kitchen doors. To the guests, he looked like a disciplined working dog. To Jessica, he looked like a candle burning in a storm, quiet but impossible to ignore. Across the room, Eleanor Voss stood beneath a banner that read "A Night for the Wild," her silver hair smooth, her cream gown elegant, her gold bird pin shining at her collar. She smiled like a woman who believed the whole room belonged to her. Martin Vale stood a few steps behind Eleanor, narrow and pale in a charcoal suit, his rimless glasses catching the light whenever he turned his head. He did not greet people warmly. He nodded, adjusted his cuffs, and checked his phone too often for a man who claimed to love charity dinners. Jessica watched him the way Rin watched a closed door. In a command van outside the conservatory, Caleb Stone monitored the building layout from a screen. He still moved carefully, one shoulder braced beneath his jacket, but his eyes were clear. He had wanted to be closer. Jessica had not allowed it. Courage, she had told him earlier, did not always mean walking into danger with a sore body and a stubborn face. Sometimes it meant staying where your mind could help more than your legs. Caleb had looked offended for 3 seconds, then accepted the headset. His voice came through Jessica's earpiece. Service hallway splits after the pantry. Left goes to the staff exit. Right goes to the cold room. Martin keeps looking toward the right. Copy, Jessica said. Eleanor stepped to the microphone. The piano faded. The room quieted. Tonight, she began. Her voice warm and tender. We gather for those who cannot ask for mercy in our language. A few donors nodded. A camera clicked. Jessica felt Rin shift once beside her. Not restless, just aware. Eleanor continued speaking about dignity, rescue, and giving wild creatures a second chance. She spoke beautifully. That was the terrible thing. A lie told poorly insulted the ear. A lie told beautifully could enter the heart wearing flowers. Jessica looked at the children's drawings on the wall and thought of Aurora's name printed again and again on documents that did not agree with one another. Then Martin moved. He slipped behind the curtain near the service hallway. Phone in hand, Jessica gave Rin a low command and followed. The music resumed behind her, soft enough to hide footsteps. The hallway smelled of roasted vegetables, coffee, winter coats, and floor polish. Rin's nose angled toward the right-hand door, the one Caleb had marked. Cold room ahead, Caleb said. 2 staff members left 5 minutes ago. No one else on camera. Jessica reached the door. It was marked Event Storage. Rin stopped before it and sat down hard. That was his signal. Jessica opened the door with the warrant team behind her. A sharp electronic chirp cut through the cold room, followed by the sudden blue flash of a laptop screen, waking in the dark. For one breath, the shelves, crates, labels, and Martin Vale's pale face appeared frozen in that ghostly light, as if the room itself had been caught telling the truth. Martin's hand hovered over a hard drive. Agent Ward, he said, voice thin but controlled. This is a private storage area. No, Jessica replied. This is evidence. Inside the cold room were folded transport cages, rolls of false food labels, shipping tags from Blue Harbor Logistics, sites forms with altered numbers, and the original ledger for the Ark expansion. Priya Nandakumar, listening from the field office, confirmed the account trail within minutes. The repeated $18,700 payments led through habitat repairs, antique handling, donor catering, and finally into a set of accounts connected to North Star's expansion fund. Martin tried to stand straighter. Those are conservation expenses. Jessica placed the torn tag from the ridge on the metal table. This code belongs to a crate listed as educational display material. The same code appears on the Aurora transfer file. The same file bills feeding costs after Aurora was supposedly moved to Oregon. The same shipment connects to Brenner Antique Storage and the Lake House catering route. His face lost a shade of color. You made one lie do 5 jobs, Jessica said. That was efficient, not clever. Outside, the music stopped again. Eleanor had seen the movement at the hallway. She arrived before uniformed agents could bring her aside, her smile still present, but no longer warm. There must be some misunderstanding. Jessica turned toward her. There was. People thought North Star was a sanctuary. Eleanor's eyes flicked toward Martin, then to the crates, then back to Jessica. I trusted my compliance officer. You trusted him to keep your hands clean. The words landed quietly. No dramatic thunder, no shattered glass. Just Eleanor standing under fluorescent storage lights, no longer framed by banners or applause. Laws. Jessica showed her the donor brochure with Aurora's image, the hidden route tags, the altered forms, and the ledger that sent money into the Ark expansion. Eleanor did not argue with every page. That silence did more than denial ever could. Within the hour, the conservatory was cleared calmly. Guests were guided out without panic. Reporters waited behind a marked line. The children's drawings remained on the wall, bright and untouched, while agents sealed boxes from the cold room. Martin Vale was taken into custody while still trying to explain that numbers could be misunderstood. Eleanor Voss walked out last, her gold bird pin dim under the porch light. North Star was secured before midnight. Blue Harbor's local records were seized. The Ark expansion accounts were frozen. Dr. Miriam Velez and Ranger Thomas Bell began coordinating transfers for the animals still inside the sanctuary, making sure they went to real rescue facilities where care did not depend on applause. As for the black leopard, no one rushed into the woods with crowds or bright lights. Dr. Velez set a quiet perimeter with the Forest Service. Trail cameras were placed far from homes. Food sources near public areas were secured. The goal was not to turn the animal into a trophy of the rescue, but to keep people safe while giving it space enough not to panic. By dawn, tracks were found beyond the North Ridge, heading deeper into National Forest. Caleb met Jessica outside the conservatory just after sunrise, wrapped in a dark coat, moving slower than he wanted anyone to notice. "You were right," he said. Jessica raised an eyebrow. "That is a dangerous habit. Try not to make it rare." He almost smiled. "Next time I see a suspicious truck, I call before I follow." "Before," Jessica said. "I said next time." Rin sneezed sharply into the snow. Caleb looked down at him. "Even the dog doubts me. He has excellent judgment." For the first time in many days, the air between them warmed with something like peace. Later that morning, Jessica stood beside the frozen lake with Rin at her side. Snow fell lightly over the pines. Far across the open white, near the dark edge of the forest, the leopard's tracks disappeared into the trees. Jessica did not need to see the animal again to understand the ending. Not every rescue ended with cameras, cages, or a hand placed proudly on a saved creature. Sometimes rescue meant distance, silence, the right not to be owned, named, sold, displayed, or turned into a story someone else could profit from. Rin looked toward the forest, ears lifted, eyes calm. Jessica rested her hand on his shoulder. Somewhere beyond the trees, a wild thing moved farther from human greed and closer to the life it had been denied. And in that quiet, snow-covered morning, Jessica felt as if the forest had spoken without a single word. Sometimes, the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder in the sky, or a voice from the clouds. Sometimes they come quietly, through a loyal dog who refuses to ignore what humans overlook, through a wounded man who still chooses mercy, through a woman brave enough to pause before fear makes the wrong decision, and through a wild creature whose silence tells the truth better than any witness ever could. The black leopard was dangerous, but it was not guilty. That may be one of the deepest lessons in this story. In life we often judge too quickly. We see fear and call it anger. We see pain and call it weakness. We see something unfamiliar and decide it must be a threat. But Jessica learned what many of us must learn in our own lives. Wisdom begins in the pause. One breath. One closer look. One choice not to let fear become cruelty. Rin reminded us that animals often sense what the human heart is too busy to notice. He did not chase blindly. He did not react with confusion. He stood steady, loyal, and alert, as if God had placed a quiet guardian beside Jessica to help her see the truth. Animals may not speak our language, but they carry their own kind of honesty. Their eyes, their fear, their trust, and their silence can become a mirror for the soul. This story is also a reminder that kindness must be more than pretty words. North Star used the language of compassion while hiding greed behind papers, money, and shining lights. But true love protects what cannot protect itself. True goodness does not turn living creatures into trophies, profits, or decorations. Every animal, whether a faithful dog at our side or a wild creature in the forest, deserves respect, space, and mercy. In our daily lives, we may not face a case like Jessica Ward, but we all meet small moments where we must choose who we are. We can choose patience instead of judgment. We can care for the animals around us. We can speak up when something feels wrong. We can help the weak, protect the voiceless, and remember that God often works through ordinary hands willing to do the right thing. Perhaps that is the quiet miracle of this story. Not that the storm stopped, not that every wound disappeared overnight, but that truth found a path through the snow. A loyal dog listened. A brave woman chose mercy. A wounded man told the truth, and a wild creature, once treated like cargo, walked back toward the forest where it belonged. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who believes in kindness, second chances, and the quiet ways God still moves among us. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from and what part of the story stayed with you the most? If you enjoy stories of faith, courage, loyal animals, and hope rising in unexpected places, please subscribe and join us for the next journey. May God bless you, protect your family, guide your steps, soften your heart toward every living creature, and fill your days with peace, kindness, and hope. Amen.